Chapter 32. The star lines collapsed down into stars, and gazing out the Falcon's viewport, Leia inhaled sharply. "Counselor?" Elagos asked, frowning at her from the co-pilot's seat. Leia pointed out at the planet Bothawui directly ahead. The planet, and the vast armada of warships swarming around it. "It's worse than I thought it would be," she said in a low voice. "Look at them all." "Yes," Elagos said softly. "Ironic, isn't it? All those mighty ships of war preparing to fight and kill and die. Widespread carnage arising from their deep respect for the Kamasi remnant." Leia looked across the cockpit at him. There was a profound sadness in his face as he stared out at the ships, a sadness tinged with an almost bitter acceptance of the inevitable. "You've tried to talk to them," she reminded him. "You and the other Trustants. I'm afraid they're beyond listening to reason." "Reason and calm are always the first casualties of such confrontations," Elagos gestured towards the gathered warships. "All that's left is the thirst for vengeance and the righting of perceived wrongs, whether those wrongs exist at all, or whether the object of the vengeance is responsible for them." He craned his neck. "Tell me, can we see the comet from here?" "Comet?" Leia asked, glancing down at her mid-range display. There was a comet there, all right, below and to portside, blocked by the Falcon's main hull. Rolling the ship a few degrees, she brought it up around and into view. "Yes, there it is," Elagos said. "Magnificent, isn't it?" "Yes," Leia agreed. It wasn't as big as some comets she'd seen, nor was its tail much more than average, but its proximity to the planet more than made up for its modest size. Still on its way inward towards its loop around the sun, it had apparently just passed through Bothawui's orbit. "We rarely saw comets from Kamas," Elagos said, his voice sounding distant. "There were few in our system, and none that came nearly so close to our world as these planet skimmers do." "There are what, 20 of them in this group?" "Something like that," Leia said. "I remember hearing once that whole branches of Bothan folklore had grown up around them. Most identifying them as omens of momentous or terrifying occurrences, no doubt," Elagos said. "Having something like that blaze past overhead barely 500,000 kilometers away would tend to make you worry," Leia agreed. "Especially with them coming by once or twice a year." She grimaced. "Of course, with Bothan backstab politics the way they are, momentous and terrifying events probably had a hard time keeping up with the comets." "I imagine so," Elagos said. "I pity them, Counselor. I really do. For all the strength and mental agility they claim their political techniques provide to their species, I see them as essentially unhappy people. Their whole outlook on life breeds mistrust, and without trust there can be no genuine peace, neither in politics nor in the quiet individuality of the heart and spirit." "I don't think I've ever thought of it quite that way before," Leia said, rotating the Falcon back to its original attitude and putting the comet again out of sight. "Did your people try to enlighten them to all that?" "I'm sure some of them did," Elagos said. "But I don't think Bothan resentment towards us was the reason they sabotaged our shields, if that's what you were wondering." Leia felt her face flush. "You sure you don't have any force sensitivity?" He smiled. "None at all," he assured her. "But the Kamasi remnant has thought long and hard about this puzzle ever since our world's destruction." He gave a full-body shrug. "My own belief is that while the saboteurs were probably threatened or blackmailed into their action by Palpatine or his agents, there was something more personal involved. Some dark secret those particular Bothans held that they feared the Kamasi knew and might someday reveal." "But you don't know what that secret might be?" Elagos shook his head. "I don't. Others of the remnant might have learned that memory, but if so, are probably unaware of its significance." Leia frowned. "Learned the memory?" "There are certain unique qualities to Kamasi memories," he told her. "Someday, perhaps, I'll tell you about them."
"Counselor!"
Sakashak's voice cut in sharply over the intercom.
"Trouble ahead!
12 degrees by 4. Leia looked out that direction. An Ashori war cruiser on the near edge of the swarm of ships seemed to be drifting towards a pair of much smaller Sifkri skiffs. Looks like he's trying to get into a lower orbit, she said. Unfortunately, that particular space is already occupied, Eligos pointed out. Yes, Leia agreed, frowning. Odd. Despite the hopeless mismatch in size and firepower, the skiffs were nevertheless holding their ground. And suddenly she saw why. Coming up fast on the skiff's far side were a pair of Diamolan blockade carriers. Eligos saw them too. I believe, he said, someone has decided to force the issue. Leia glanced across the rest of the gathered ships. Others were starting to react to the imminent confrontation, starting to drift out of their confining orbital slots or opening fighter bay doors or rotating so as to better target the nearest of the opposition. The Sifkri skiffs were starting to waver now, clearly not eager to be at the center of a massive firefight. The Ashori, recognizing their hesitation, increased its speed towards them. In response, the two Diamala also picked up their pace, splitting formation into a flank crossfire stance. They're going to run down those Sifkris, Eligos murmured. Or else the Diamala will open fire on the Ashori to prevent it. Either way, both sides will claim the other was the instigator. And either way, the shooting starts, Leia said tightly, running her fingers down the sensor data. New Republic ships. There had to be some New Republic ships out there somewhere. If one of them was close enough to intervene, or even get in between the Ashori and Diamala. But there were only 3 Corellian corvettes carrying New Republic IDs, all on the far side of the pack of ships. No chance at all that they could get to the confrontation in time. Which meant it was up to her. Everyone hang on, she called towards the intercom. Without waiting for a reply from the 2 Nagri, she turned the Falcon's nose towards the Ashori cruiser and threw full power to the sublight drive. The engines roared to life, the acceleration pushing Leia momentarily into her seat before the compensators could catch up. I trust you have a plan, Eligos said calmly over the noise. Do bear in mind that your High Council authority will not likely be enough to stop them. I wasn't even going to bring that up, Leia said, glancing at the nav display and easing the helm yoke back just a bit. The Falcon was now on a collision course with the Ashori cruiser's stern. Take over, she added, pulling off her restraints and snagging her lightsaber as she got up from her seat. Keep us on this course. Understood, Eligos's voice came distantly back to her as she sprinted down the tunnel and skidded past the exit hatchway towards the aft cargo bay bulkhead door. She stretched out to the control switch with the force as she approached, sending the door sliding open. Counselor? Barkim's anxious voice called from the upper quad laser. Stay there, Leia called to him as she ducked into the cargo bay and crossed to the starboard side of the ship. Through one more door, and she came at last to the access grille protecting the starboard power converters and ion flux stabilizer. Han was going to kill her, but it was their only chance. Igniting her lightsaber, clenching her teeth, she jabbed the glowing blade into one of the power converters and dragged it across into the stabilizer, and grabbed for a handhold as the Falcon bucked like a stung tauntaun. It bucked again, and suddenly the drone of the engines changed to an ominous whine. 20 seconds later, she was back in the cockpit. Report, she asked as she slid back into her seat. We've lost starboard maneuvering, Eligos said. The engines appear to be trying to go into a feedback instability. He glanced at her. I certainly hope this is part of your plan. Trust me, Leia assured him, trying to feel as confident as she sounded as she keyed the comm. Ishori Cruiser, this is the freighter Millennium Falcon. We're in serious trouble and urgently request assistance. There was no answer. Ishori Cruiser! This is the Ashori War Cruiser Predominance, an angry-sounding Ashori voice snarled from the speaker. Identify yourself. This is the New Republic High Counselor Leia Organa Solo aboard the freighter Millennium Falcon, Leia said. We've lost maneuvering and power control on our starboard engines. Our current course has us passing too close to your hull. I need you to move immediately out of our path while we try to regain control. There was another long pause. Leia watched the warship looming ever nearer, uncomfortably aware that if the Ashori commander chose, he could easily turn this whole thing to his own advantage. He had only to use her request as an excuse to speed up his drive towards the Sifkri skiffs. Try saying that 3 times fast. I ask you to please hurry, Leia said. A thought occurred to her, and she reached over to blur the fine focus of her comm a bit, just enough to let some of the other ships beyond the Ashori eavesdrop on the transmission. My passenger, Trustant Elegos Akla, is attempting to effect repairs, but I'm afraid the equipment aboard is not within standard Kamasi technical expertise. Without a word, Elegos unstrapped and got to his feet, disappearing out through the cockpit door. Ashori cruiser predominance. Do you still copy? Leia added. Repeating. No need to repeat, the voice snarled again. Leia felt automatic anger stirring in response to the tone, forced herself to remember that all the emotion in the Ashori voice meant that there was some serious thinking going on. She shifted her eyes to the cruiser again and held her breath. And abruptly the Ashori's advance towards the skiff slowed, its stern rotating instead out of the Falcon's path. We stand ready to assist you and trust in the claw, the Ashori bit out, his voice already sounding calmer. The thinking was over, and it was time for action. Lower your shields and prepare for acceleration impact, he continued. We will attempt to lock a tractor beam onto you to slow your rush. Thank you, Leia said, keying off the shields. They didn't affect tractor beams all that much, but there was no point in making a tricky high-speed grab any harder than it already was. Once we're into your beams, we'll try to add a cold shutdown and see if we can bring this under control. We stand ready to provide any assistance you and Trusted Akla require, the Ashuri said. Stand ready. The Falcon jerked as the tractor beam caught it, wobbled a moment, then settled down as the lock firmed. Reaching across to the engine controls, Leia threw the shutdown switches. The engine whine ran down the scale and faded into silence. On the control board, indicators turned red. Around her, the lights flickered once as battery power took over. We read successful shutdown, the Ashori reported. If you wish, we will bring you aboard our ship to assist you in your repairs. For a moment, Leia was tempted. Having a Kamasi aboard one of the most outspoken and confrontational species ships might help stretch the peace out here. But on the other hand, it could also be misinterpreted as Elegos's tacit endorsement of the Ashori's anti-Bothan stance. Thank you again, she told the alien, but we have an urgent appointment with President Gaversom that we can't delay. If you could escort us over to the group of New Republic ships, we would very much appreciate it. Of course, the Ashori said, with only the barest hesitation. The Diamala had reached the Sifkri skiffs now, the 4 of them standing together in quiet defiance against any further action. The chance had been missed, and the Ashori knew it. As did the rest of the Armada. All around them, Leia saw, the other ships were starting to settle back into their taut, watchful waiting. The flashpoint was safely passed, or at least this flashpoint was. She keyed off the comm. You're really taking a beating this trip, aren't you? She murmured, patting the Falcon's control board sympathetically. I'm sorry. The door behind her slid open. I see it worked, Elegos said, slipping into the co-pilot seat again. You have a fine and unique gift of diplomacy, Counselor. And sometimes I'm just lucky, Leia said. Elegos lifted his eyebrows. I thought the Jedi didn't believe in luck. It comes of hanging around Han on this ship, Leia said dryly. Where did you go, anyway? Back to look at the stabilizer? The Kamasi nodded. I didn't expect to be able to do anything, certainly not after you'd finished with it, but you'd indicated I was trying to repair it, and I wanted there to be some truth in what you were saying. Truth, Leia sighed. That's what we need here, Elegos. What we need desperately. Truth. Captain Solo will have that truth here within another day, Elegos reminded her quietly. All you and President Gaversom need to do is hold things together that long. Leia stretched out with the Force, trying to get a feel for the future. No, I don't think so, she said slowly. Something tells me it's not going to be that easy. Not nearly that easy. Navet and Cliff had cut through the door of the Hodin Tap Cafe's storage sub-basement floor their first night of work, a 10-minute task with the fusion cutter Penson had scrounged from somewhere. But after that, the job had switched over to something longer, harder, and considerably more tedious. 4 more days of this, huh? Cliff grunted, heaving another shovelful of noxious Bothawui dirt out of the chest-deep hole onto the large drop cloth they'd spread out to catch it. Well, if we really put our backs into it, maybe it'll only take 3, Navitt pointed out, scooping up the dirt from the cloth in turn and dumping it into their Volcrux fusion disintegration canister. He sympathized with Cliff's frustrations, but there wasn't a lot either of them could do about it. The vibrations of their digging were iffy enough, but if they tried operating heavy equipment within range of the power conduit sensors, they'd bring Bothan security down on them in double quick time. Thanks lots, Cliff said dryly, dumping another shovelful. You know, I don't mind dying for the Empire, but to Vader with these preliminaries. Watch your words, Navitt warned him, glancing at the door at the top of the sub-basement. Fenton was supposed to be keeping an eye on the door, but there were a handful of other staff and night guards still up in the tap cafe, and a wrong word overheard by one of them could ruin everything. He scooped up the next shovelful. There was a scrabbling sound at the door. Navitt let the shovel down silently onto the cloth, dropping to one knee and drawing his blaster in a single smooth motion. He leveled the weapon on the door, then lifted it at the soft 212 knock. The door opened and Horvick stuck his head around the corner. Pack it up, he hissed. The night guards think they've spotted an intruder, and they might come down here looking. Cliff was already out of the hole, manhandling the square of Duracrete floor they'd cut back into place. They get a good look? Navitt asked, holstering his blaster and giving Cliff a hand. I don't know, Horvick said grimly. But personally, my money's on that old woman of yours. I spotted someone with your description of her sitting off in a corner booth when Penson and I came on duty. Terrific, Navitt snarled under his breath, leaving Cliff to disguise the edges of their trapdoor as he shut off the disintegrator and carried it back to its hiding place behind a stack of Vodacrene cases. Well, don't just stand there. Go help them find her. Right, Horvick said. What about you? We'll head outside, he said. Maybe we can tag her on her way out. Happy hunting, Horvick said, and disappeared. It took 30 seconds to fold up the drop cloth and hide it, and another minute to ease their way up through the main basement to the gimmicked back door. The streets in this part of Drevstarn were mostly deserted at this hour, the high-mounted globe panels dimmed to a fairly low light. I'll take back here, Navitt murmured to Cliff. You circle around front. Don't let anyone see you. Don't worry. Moving like a shadow, Cliff headed down the side alley and disappeared around the corner of the building. Checking both directions, Navitt crossed to a trash container a few meters away. Sinking into its shadow, he balanced his blaster across one knee and waited. And waited. Occasionally he spotted figures hurrying by in front of the lighted windows of the tap cafe, and several times the Hodin or one of his night guards poked their head out of the back door, double-checked the lock, and went back in. But no one came out and stayed out. Not the woman or anyone else. It was an hour before the commotion seemed to finally die down inside. Navitt waited another 30 minutes, irritably counting the number of shovelfuls behind schedule this was costing them, before finally pulling out his comlink. Cliff? Nothing, Cliff's voice came back. He sounded irritated, too. Sounds like they've given up. Must have been a false alarm, Navitt said. Come on around and we'll get back to work. A few minutes later, they were back in the sub-basement. Cliff retrieved the drop cloth as Navitt headed around the stacked Vodacrene cases for the disintegrator. And paused there. Lying on top of the disintegrator was a comlink. Cliff, he called softly. Come here. A moment later, the other was at his side. I don't believe it, he said, sounding stunned. How in blazes did she pull this one off? Why don't we ask her, Navitt said, carefully picking up the comlink. It was a binary linked type, he noted, the sort typically carried on small starships and connected only to another specific comlink. He gave it a quick once-over for booby traps, then flicked it on. You're very inventive, he said. I'll give you that. Why, thank you, the old woman's voice came back promptly. That's very flattering, particularly coming from an Imperial dirty tricks teen. Navitt glanced at Cliff. You know, that's the second time you've accused us of being Imperials, he reminded her. You are just guessing, of course. Oh, hardly, she said scornfully. Who else would be looking to take down the Bothan's planetary shields? You're still just guessing, Nevitt said, straining his ears for some sign of telltale sounds in the background, and wishing viciously he had the equipment that would let him trace the transmission. If you were sure, you'd have called Bothan security instead of still skulking around yourself this way. Who says I haven't called them? She said. Or maybe I like skulking around. It could be I used to do this sort of thing all the time against Huts and other slime. Maybe I'm looking for a new challenge. Or maybe you're looking for an early and violent death, Nevitt countered. How did you find us, anyway? Oh, come on, she chided. You don't really think your cover is that good, do you? My new rep buddies and I had you pegged first time off the rack. So what was the deal with those metal mites at the shield generators, anyway? Nevitt smiled tightly. Fishing now, are we? Please. You never can tell, she said. Incidentally, whichever of you gimmicked that back door lock needs to do a better job next time. It was so obvious you might as well have hung a sign on it. It did come in handy, though. I imagine it did, Nevitt said. You're still in the building, aren't you? Now who's fishing? She countered. Actually, no. I left some time ago. There's a crawl space beneath the ceiling that leads to a handy skylight. That was a free one. Thank you, Nevitt said between clenched teeth. Who did this little fringe slime think she was talking to, anyway? Here's some free advice in return. Go back to your ship and clear out Bothawui. If you don't, you are going to die in this dirt ball. I will personally guarantee that. With all due respect, Lieutenant. Or is it Major? Colonel? Oh well. With the Empire in shambles these days, I guess rank doesn't really matter. With all due respect, Imperial, I've been threatened by far more impressive folks than you. Anytime you want to come out and do a face-to-face, I'm ready. Oh, we'll do a face-to-face all right, Navitt promised, forcing down his anger. Anger and the muddled thinking that accompanied it were exactly what she was angling for. Don't worry about that. But when we do, it'll be a time and place of my choosing, not yours. Whatever you want, she said. Nighttime would work best. That way you can use that Zero Night stinger of yours to full advantage. You didn't just throw it away after that riot a few weeks back, did you? The one where you framed Solo for shooting into the crowd? Navitt glared at the comlink. Aside for being a general all-around pain in the neck, this woman was far too well informed. Who in space did she work for, anyway? You're fishing again, he said. Not really, she said offhandedly. Just putting two and two together. Sometimes that kind of math doesn't work the way you think it does, Navitt warned her. And sometimes if the mathematician hangs around where she's not welcome, she doesn't live to finish her sums. She clucked. You're starting to repeat yourself, Imperial. If I were you, I'd try to work up some fresh threats. However, it's well past my bedtime, and I know you have work to do, so I'll let you go. Unless you'd like to go fetch your Zeril and come out and play, that is. I'll wait. Thanks, Nevitt said. I'll pass for now. Entirely up to you, she said. Go ahead and keep the comlink. I've got plenty of spares. Good night, and happy digging. The transmission clicked off. And restless and unpleasant dreams to you too, Navitt murmured, dropping the comlink into the disintegrator. He looked back at Cliff. This, he said darkly, is just exactly what we needed. Oh, exactly, Cliff ground out. So what are we going to do about her? For now, nothing, Navitt said, picking up the disintegrator and lugging it over to the drop cloth. For all her fishing and accusations, she doesn't really know anything. Like blazes she doesn't, Cliff retorted. She knows we're digging over one of the shield building's power conduits. What more does she need? My point exactly, Navitt said. She spotted our digging, but hasn't called security down on us. He squatted down and eased his shovel blade under the edge of the trapdoor. Why not? How should I know? Cliff grumbled, getting his shovel into place under the other side. Maybe she figures she'll pick up a bounty if she can deliver something in a neat package. Could be, Navitt said, lifting carefully. The block came up and he got his fingers under the edge. I think it's more likely she's got some trouble of her own with the Bothans that means she can't go to them with any accusations. That wouldn't stop her from calling in an anonymous tip, Cliff grunted as they eased the trapdoor off the hole. The mood they're in out there, they're probably jumping at every cracked twig. No, Nevitt said, gazing into the hole. No, she's not the type for anonymous tips. I think that for whatever reason, she's decided to take this whole thing personally. Professional pride, maybe. I don't know. The point is that she's turned this into a private duel between her and us. Cliff grunted. Pretty stupid. Stupid for her, Navitt agreed. Useful for us. Maybe, Cliff said. So what now? We get back to work, Navitt said, dropping into the hole. And when we're done, he added, digging his shovel into the packed dirt at his feet, I'll go retrieve the Zeril. Maybe tomorrow night we'll take her up on her invitation to come out and play. Gavrosom looked up from Leia's datapad, his prehensile wingtips flicking restlessly across the desk beside it. And you truly believe he is sincere about this? He said. Very sincere, Leia said, feeling a frown creasing her forehead. She had expected a considerably more positive reaction to Pelian's peace proposal. And I examined the credentials he brought from the Imperial Moffs. Everything was in order. Or so it appeared, Gavrosom said, shaking his mane. So it appeared. He looked back down at the datapad, touched the control to scroll back. Leia watched him, trying to understand the strange and unexpected emotional conflict she could sense in him. An end to the long war might finally be at hand. Surely this was news for at least cautious excitement. So why wasn't he cautiously excited? Gavrosom looked up at her again. There's no mention of Thrawn anywhere in here, he pointed out. Did you ask Pelion about that? We discussed it briefly, Leia said. At that time, he'd received no word from Bastion that Thrawn had assumed supreme command, nor had he any indication that the Moffs had rescinded his authorization to begin peace talks. Neither of which means anything at all, Gavrosom said, his tone suddenly and uncharacteristically harsh. With Thrawn on the scene, officially or otherwise, this is utterly meaningless. He slapped a wingtip across the datapad. I understand your concerns, Leia said, choosing her words carefully. But if it's not a trick, this may be our chance to finally end this long war. It is most certainly a trick, Counselor, Gavrosom ground out. That much we can all be sure of. The only question is what exactly Thrawn hopes to gain from it. Leia drew back in her seat. The flash of emotion right then. You don't want Pelion's offer to be genuine, do you? She asked. You want it to be a trick. Gavrosom turned his eyes away from her, snorting a soft, whinnying sigh. Look all around us, Leia, he said quietly, turning his head to gaze out the stateroom viewport. Look at them. Nearly 200 warships, dozens of people, all ready to begin a civil war over their own individual concepts of what constitutes justice for Kamas. The New Republic is poised, ready to destroy itself, and there's nothing I can do to prevent it. Han has a copy of the Kamas document, Leia reminded him. He'll have it here tomorrow. That should diffuse a lot of the tension. I'm sure it will, Gavrosom agreed. But at this point, I'm not willing to rely on even that to stop them. You and I both know that for many of the potential combatants, Kamas has merely become a convenient excuse for restarting old wars with old enemies. I realize that, Leia said. But once that excuse is taken away from them, they'll have to back down. Or create a different excuse, Gavrosom countered bitterly. The fact is, Leia, that the New Republic is in danger of fragmenting, of being driven apart by our own vast diversity. We need time to counter these forces, time to talk, time to plan, time to try and build all these different peoples into some sort of unity. He waved a wing towards the viewport. But we no longer have that time. This crisis has snatched it away from us. We need to get it back. The Kamas document will do that, Leia insisted. I'm sure it will. Perhaps, Gavrosom said. But as president, I can't afford to put all my hopes on it. I must prepare to muster every common purpose I can find for the New Republic. Every common purpose, every common goal, every common cultural ethos. He tapped the datapad gently this time. And if necessary, every common enemy. But they're not a real enemy anymore, Leia said, striving to keep her voice calm. They're far too small and weak to be any kind of threat. Perhaps, Gaversom said, but as long as they're out there, we have someone to unite against. He hesitated. Or even to fight against, if necessary. You aren't serious, Leia said, gazing hard at him. Stirring up action against the Empire at this point would be nothing short of a slaughter. I know that. He shook his head. I don't like this any better than you do, Leia. In fact, I will admit to being ashamed of using the people of the Empire this way. But whether my name and memory are denounced by history is of no importance. My job is to hold the New Republic together, and I will do whatever is necessary to achieve that. Perhaps I have more faith in our people than you do, Leia said quietly. Perhaps you do, Gaversom said with a nod. I sincerely hope you are right. For a moment they sat together in silence. I presume you won't be releasing news of Pelian's offer, Leia said at last. With your permission, though, I'd like to begin putting together a list of delegates for a full peace conference, if and when you decide to proceed with this. Gaversom hesitated, then nodded. I admire your confidence, Counselor, he said. I only wish I could share it. Yes, please assemble your list. Thank you. She got up from her chair and retrieved her datapad. I'll have the list ready for you by tomorrow. She turned to the stateroom door. There is, of course, one other option open to you, Gaversom called from behind her. You are merely on leave of absence from the presidency. Assuming the Senate confirmed the decision, you could resume that office right now. I know, Leia said, but this isn't the time for that. Yours is the voice that has been speaking for Coruscant since the Kamas document first came to light. It wouldn't be good for that voice to suddenly change. Perhaps, Gaversom said, but there are many in the New Republic who believe that Calabops are skilled at words and nothing more. Perhaps the time for words is ended, and the time for action has arrived. Leia stretched out briefly to the Force. The time for action may indeed have come, she agreed. But that doesn't mean the time for words is ended. Both will always be needed. Gaversom whinnied softly. Then I will continue with the words, he said, and will entrust to you the actions. May the Force be with us both. May the Force be with us all, Leia said quietly. Good night, President Gaversom. And that's the end of the chapter. Hope you enjoyed it. Talk to you soon.